Hello, everyone. Bear with us for just a moment. We've got just waiting on two of our panelists to join us. And then we will get into formal introductions in just a moment. Since we are 5 minutes after our start time, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And as our additional panelists come into the attendee list, I will invite them on stage to become panelists in our presentation today. So welcome, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Reimaging the Archives, the Impact of Black Voices in Community Movement, Arts, and Education. This is a series of 3 conversations over the course of the day brought to you on behalf of the Our Story, Our Terms project as part of the Movement History Initiative. My name is John Gartrell, and I serve as director of the John Hope Franklin Research Center for African and African American History and Culture here at Duke University in the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library. And I'm going to be the host for the moderator for our first conversation today. Let me tell you a little bit about the Movement History Initiative, and I'm going to talk for a few minutes because this is the first session, and I want to make sure everybody's grounded on what we're doing. The Movement History Initiative is a collaboration between activists from the SNCC Legacy Project and members from the Movement for Black Lives, academics and archivists who are dedicated to documenting the grassroots organizing tradition from the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which was the principal activist strategy of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the long tail of that tradition today. The Our Story, Our Terms project is the latest project in this decade-long partnership that has worked through funding from the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and other sources to document movement building from the bottom up and the inside out. One of the key facets of this work has been deploying Black archivists and memory workers, led by our project archivist, Leah M. Kerr, to work with modern activist groups on archiving and telling their stories. Leah, who is our host for all the conversations for today, but is under the weather, unfortunately, did the work to see what type of projects and initiatives had already been done in the field of memory work, digitization, documentary, community archiving, to see how the Our Story, Our Terms project could build on the growing wave of Black memory workers who have been doing this sort of work either through other institutions like Duke and universities and colleges, local history institutions, or doing the work on their own. Leah has shared a welcome that she's asked me to read to the audience today. So this is from Leah. Welcome, and thanks for joining the conversation. These talks arose from what wowed me while working on this extraordinary Our Story, Our Terms project. We are seeking to help Black freedom movement groups to archive their work while in action as accurate documentation for themselves, historians, and other activists in the future. Too many times in the past, Black freedom movement groups have been misrepresented by historians, archives, and journalists. We want to get ahead of that for the movement for Black Lives era groups. Along the way, we met artists, archivists, activists who are finding unique paths to amplify their voices with archival primary sources. I felt it would be a disservice for the OSOT project to go dark, and I'll note that we're completing the project and at the end of this year to go dark without shining a light on some of these efforts. This conversation and the conversations that will follow us is just a taste of what is out there. Hopefully, it will be a point of inspiration and very practical how-tos for others to document, speak, paint, illustrate, recreate their experiences to add to the fullness of our striving for all, for freedom for all. Thanks for coming, and thanks for our speakers being my voice as bronchitis has taken mine away. So thank you, Leah, so much for that welcome. The first session is entitled Say It Loud, Telling Our Stories. The other two conversations can also be viewed through separate Zoom links. If you haven't already, you can register for them. And I'm going to put those links in the chat. And so I'm going to begin to fade away a little bit in terms of talking and get our conversation underway. And so we'll engage for about 60 minutes or so, and then open it up to you in the audience to send us questions via the Q&A and the chat. And so joining me today is Elisa Ray Funderburk. Elisa Ray is a Mississippi-based oral historian focused on Black storytelling, interviewing, and transcription. At the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State University, Funderburk maintains an oral history archive dedicated to the preservation, interpretation, and dissemination of African-American history and culture. She's also the creator of the nonprofit Black Oral Historian Network. Previously, she served as Deputy Director of the Columbia Life Histories Project. Elisa Ray, thanks for joining us. And I'm going to do one more quick span of our audience just to make sure some of our other panelists aren't hanging out in the audience. And if not, then we'll soldier on and the two of us will just talk. How does that sound?
That sounds fine by me.
Okay. All right. I feel like we could do it. I believe in us.
I talk all the time, so.
Okay. Well, as an oral historian, I'm sure you talk quite a bit. So I'm looking forward to it.
Not as much as I listen, but yes.
Yeah, okay. All right. So Elisa Ray, I wonder just to start, and the purpose of this session is to really explore the evolving methods of capturing, interpreting, and documenting Black stories. What was your origin story for being involved in archives?
Yeah, it's actually a really good question because I have never really been involved in archives per se before my current job at the Margaret Walker Center. I've been involved adjacently, like as a student and researcher. I've spent time in archives. As a writer, both I was like on my high school newspaper, I was the editor. And then I wrote like creative pieces in college and things like that. So I spent a lot of time in the library, which I don't think a lot of people necessarily consider as an archive, but I think the public library is probably one of the most important spaces we have in America. And so I think if you bear with me, that is really my introduction to the archives is the public library. And I think all of the work that I do at the Margaret Walker Center is to make our archive as accessible and as friendly a place and as useful as your local public library, which I think honestly, when you're at a university, that's not always the case. I feel like university libraries are often seen as being very separate from their larger communities, as being maybe even hostile, because they're usually on a campus and there are layers of security to get into these spaces. Most people don't feel like those are places where they're welcome. And the Margaret Walker Center is separate from the Jackson State University's library system. And for that reason, we are able to present ourselves as a more open facing archive. So to answer your question, my origin story, I think, for being involved in archives, besides my love and passion for the public library as a child and all through my adulthood, was becoming an oral historian. I started my master's degree um, in oral history at Columbia University in 2017. And ever since then, I've been working as an oral historian to collect stories. And obviously, those stories all have to go somewhere. And so that's really when I started working more closely with the archival process. And then in 2019, early 2020, the end of 2019 and early 2020, I accepted the position here at Jackson State and I moved from New York to Mississippi and I started working in the Margaret Walker Center's archives.
So I'm gonna share my story if that's okay.
I would
And
love
we
to hear
can,
your story. Yeah.
because I'm fascinated by how your start was in the public library. I would say mine was as well. I can recall being a student in high school taking an AP history class, and we had to write about um, a significant day in history, like in the past. And so I chose to uh, look at newspapers from the day that my parents were born, right? And so that led me to the microfilm room in the library. And here I am in the public library and an archive. Ironically, I work in the library today. I feel like it's followed me for my whole life. But I still love microfilm readers to this day. I wish we had more of them. People need to learn how to crank those things. But I think what it did for me in terms of the that start as in being in high school was just this connection. And I always had a fascination with history, like a lot of people who do memory work do. Like they get engaged with it very early, even if it's not through the traditional path of being a historian or oral history in your case. Um, so doing that work and looking in the newspaper and saying, oh, they were building a highway when my father was born. And like I drive up and down this highway all the time and making just that connection from a personal story to like what's going on in the world. And I think um that has kind of stuck with me through my professional career, where my first job was um, finding was at the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis, Maryland. And I was a research archivist who was charged with looking through antebellum newspapers to document the instances of enslaved people running away. And so the whole idea was to build this repository, this database of runaway advertisements of African Americans who had essentially left the places where they were
Stolen their freedom.
enslaved. Right. So, but that's I would say the interesting thing about it though, was that as I was turning the pages and we were taking, old school digital cameras, we were taking like photos overhead and learned how to crop things and all this good stuff. Um, Finding those advertisements um, allowed me to see a different side of the life of enslaved people, because they weren't necessarily running away to freedom. They were running to family members. Like, like advertisement might say, you know, John, age 16, ran away to his mother at so and so's farm. or he's got a relative at this location. And so freedom is a lot different from just removing themselves from bondage per se, but it might have been freedom from the standpoint of having the autonomy to make a choice to be engaged with your family, your kin. And I tell people all the time, like the two most famous runaway slaves are from the state of Maryland. That's Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, right? And so there's, although you don't necessarily think of Maryland as this long, you don't think of it as a traditional slaveholding state in the way that you
Right.
would where you are in Mississippi, right? That's the first place people think of, like Mississippi,
Yeah.
but that story and the work um, of extracting those people from those newspapers really humanized those African American lives in a way that um, that really sort of changed my trajectory, I'll say. Um, and just to kind of build on what was it about oral history that drew you into archives and as a graduate student especially?
Yeah. So like I said, when you're doing oral history, the oral histories have to wind up somewhere. And so doing that part of the work, I like to call it like the after work, a lot of the time, it's important because what's the sense, what's the point of interviewing someone and going through all the trouble of conducting an oral history interview if you're not planning on preserving it and making it accessible and available to the public? I like to call oral history like a more democratic way of collecting history. And part of democracy is like everybody gets to be involved, everybody gets to have access, everybody gets a piece of it. And you want your oral histories to be archived somewhere where that is the principle, that is the case. They're not being locked up behind a paywall or put in a shelf nobody can access or find. You want it to be accessible in that way. So that's where I started to really think about archives and the importance of archives and the differences between types of archives, what different archives require or need. I learned that in grad school, especially looking at the Columbia University Library System, their rare books and manuscripts library, which is where the oral histories were housed. It's called the Center for Oral History Research. Um, that was the first archive I was introduced to as an oral historian in thinking in those ways. But since then, I've obviously been connected to a lot of other people like yourself who are doing similar work and working in archives all across the country, largely universities. Unfortunately, again, because of the kinds of barriers that most university campuses present to their surrounding communities. But there are community archives too, lots of different community archives or online archives, because the technology allows for that, that create spaces for these oral histories to exist in a way that other people can use and access them. Um, did that answer your question?
No, it definitely did.
Yeah.
And what I'll do is I'm going to come back to that because it really,
Yeah, because we got Gina now.
yeah, we do have Gina. Hi, Gina. If you can go off camera, by all means, do. So let me introduce Gina Valentine, who is a mother, visual artist, and educator. Her practice is transformed by traditional craft techniques and interweaves historians' talent within found text, objects, narratives, and spaces. Gina's work involves language translation, mining content from material and digital archives, and experimental strategies for humanizing data visualization. She is assistant professor of print media at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and also co-founder of Black Lunch Table and Oral History Archiving Project. So, Gina, welcome. We're just getting started. So we had our first question, but I'm going to get to you for the next question, if that's okay. And I want to note that you're on mute, so you can unmute yourself when I hit the question mark on it. So, um, wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you experienced archives in your early career and sort of what was the impetus for the Black Lunch Table Project?
That is a great question. Um, oh, and I'm excited to update my profile that I gave you. I'm been promoted to associate and now I'm professor, full professor. Hey,
Standing.
yeah.
Congrats.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Early, yeah, I guess so. Black Lunch Table came around as a result of a perceived lack of the information that we were looking for in archives. Heather Hart, who was my collaborator, and I both went to, pretty prestigious and art programs and prestigious universities with great art history programs, but also felt that the history that we were really interested in diving into was just missing from the standard curriculum. We noted that, a lot of our histories were missing, our mentors were missing, our colleagues now and mentees are missing, and Black Lunch Table is always meant to, I guess, fill those holes in the cultural and art historical record. So the brief history of the project is that it started back in 2005 when we were children at Skowhegan Artist Residency in Maine. And we wanted to collaborate on something. We collaborated on some other projects as well, but we wanted to create a space that was an affinity space, an intentional affinity space, and thinking about perception and how we, as young Black artists, were perceived within this predominantly white space, right? So we invited everyone, well, all of the Black residents, of which I think there were 12, including the dean and the then director and some of the visiting artists, to sit together at lunch, and we shared space and talked. And the project itself was really born out of that moment. We didn't come with a set agenda of like what we were going to talk about, but we ended up talking about our graduate programs and who was there and who was not there, what kind of support we needed, how we imagined we would ultimately be mentors one day. And fast forward to 2014, I think, we hosted a very large version of that very small project at Dorchester Projects, which is at the Astor Gates compound here in Chicago. I think we had upwards of 100 participants that day at different roundtables, people that were already at the conference coming through. We prompted people to think about how their shared narratives could be articulated together and prompted by each other, just to talk about like what does it mean to be a Black visual artist or a visual artist who identifies as Black right now. And the prompts that we offered were about mentorship, about when to show. One of the topics was, do we show in February? Because we're always asked to show in February. Trying to think of the questions, but I think that ultimately those conversations always end up beginning with the prompts that we offer and end up in places where the participants find these commonalities that they want to explore together, and that becomes the narrative. How long do I have to answer this question? Because I could talk
You got
about
all the time you need. You're good.
Okay. Um, so yeah, that was kind of a seminal moment for Black Lunch Table, because it was also the first time we had thought to record. So we recorded these conversations, which prompted us to think about where these recordings would live. Like, how would we contribute these to an oral history, something that exists? And in looking for places where these histories might make sense, we realized that they didn't really make any sense anywhere. So we were going to build an archive ourselves, which we did, and are still doing. we also, during that time, started poking around in other archives that include narratives and records of and by Black artists, and realized that a lot of our mentors, again, were just missing, or a lot of our colleagues were missing from these records. We thought, well, maybe they're on Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is supposedly, a compendium of all knowledge. And no, they were not there either. So we started a Wikipedia project. So in part because we were also interested in what is on Wikipedia. So people tend to edit what they feel comfortable with. Like, you don't have to come with any set expertise. So there's there's a lot of history on like World of Warcraft and like Pokemon, and a whole lot of articles are missing for Black artists. Our task list presently has 1,300-ish people on it, and these are people that are either completely missing a record, or people whose records still need updating because they're alive, right? And I guess the other thing that's notable in relation to the question is that we're, another part of both areas of the project is that we're actively engaged in getting people to work with archives, right? And so thinking about who comes to Wikipedia editathons, who feels they have the authority to edit a Wikipedia article. It's really interesting. And that project in particular really shifts the demographic of people that are actively engaged in contributing to Wikipedia, and so contributing to the record. Your question was, how did you experience archives early in your career? Yeah, so that's yeah, just as things that we're missing. Maybe a more fun fact about me is that I think I was in 5th grade. I had a really bad habit of hiding the overdue library books under my bed. And as a way to pay my dues, my mother and the librarian agreed that I would return the books, and I would work in the library for the spring, which I think was formative, actually, because I spent a whole lot of time there and thought about why books are categorized the way they were. And we actually had card catalogs back then, so you had to know how to navigate all of that. Yeah.
See, something about libraries. It's a running theme of the panel.
It really is. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I was definitely lied to as a child, and I was told that late library books would affect my credit score. And for some reason, that really worked on me. I didn't have a credit score, obviously, but
Yeah.
Someone said score, and I was just,
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna we've drawn on a few themes here, and I'm gonna welcome our third panelist for the day, Charlie Cobb. Charlie, how you doing? So let me give a little bit of an introduction, and Charlie, you're on mute, so I'm gonna point out to you, and you can unmute yourself while I'm introducing you. So Charlie Cobb is a distinguished journalist, educator, and activist. As a field secretary with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, he originated the idea of freedom schools as part of the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer Project. He began his journalism career in 1974 and has worked in a range of positions, including as a reporter for WHUR radio in Washington, D.C., National Public Radio as a foreign affairs reporter, bringing that network its first regular coverage of Africa. It's a news from the continent, and National Geographic staff member. And if I recall, Charlie, you were the first Black staff writer at National Geographic.
And still the only one, amazingly.
Okay.
They have never had another, I hope I didn't cause that, but they have never had another Black staff writer. And they no longer have staff writers and photographers, of course.
Okay, and Charlie is we're going to get back to that in a minute. Charlie is also the author of a number of books, including this Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. And Charlie is a board member of the SNCC Legacy Project, which is one of the project partners for the Our Story, Our Terms project. So Charlie, welcome. We're just digging into a few things, and I wanted to just continue to come back to the name of our panel is Say It Loud, Telling Our Stories. And so I wonder from your perspective as an activist and an organizer in the 1960s and really throughout your whole life, and then even into the journalism field, how did you, this is going to sound, I'm going to say this wrong and then you can correct me. How did you get people to tell you their story?
Well, I have to go back to the influence of Jim Foreman in SNCC, who was a historian by training. And Jim, and believe me, as people who were 18, 19, 20 years old, we had no instinct about this. Jim would always be leaning over our shoulder when he visited our projects. Put it down, right. Right, you've got to write it down. And as a result, SNCC probably has the most comprehensive set of field reports of its work of any of the civil rights organizations that were working in the 60s. But I mean, SNCC people wrote them. These are not historians and journalists coming to visit SNCC projects. These are reports. And a lot of it is on the SNCC Legacy Project site. And they're certainly, for me, some stuff I've forgotten. So they're a fascinating read. But I have to credit Jim Foreman and his pressure, because we would have never have done that. We were sending in weekly field reports about what was going on. And combined, the other piece of this is, as organizers, we were continually dissatisfied with the kind of reporting on the work we were doing. First, it was largely ignored. Two, it was usually often wrongly reported. The press, from our vantage point, as organizers in particular, missed the point in general. And history itself, in the broader sense of historians and academia and the academy and all of that, wasn't much better in its writing about the history. In the early days of when people were writing about SNCC, that begins to change somewhere in I would say in the mid 80s or maybe a little later, that you begin to see a distinctive difference in the kind of historical writing about SNCC that was an improvement on what the writing about SNCC by historians had been, ranging from the kinds of questions they asked to their interpretations, or the people they did not talk to. It was very hard back in the day to get academics in particular to realize that they ought to talk to local people, ordinary, the people who actually made the movement. People forget, for all her fame, that Mrs. Hamer was a sharecropper with a 6th grade education, and she was better educated than most sharecroppers. People forget, and all of the ordinary people who gave strength to the movement in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, don't exist in the historical canon anymore, unless people like me write about them, and some of the other younger generation of scholars now are tackling and writing about this. So all of that is part of I never saw myself as an archivist. I was just dissatisfied with what had been written. I knew I could do better and started to write about it, first as a reporter, and now I write books mostly. And for SNCC more broadly, this cropped up on the commemoration of SNCC's 50th anniversary in a group of us. And I suppose that comes with age. A group of us were talking about what to do now that we were old and getting ready to move off the scene, so to speak. What should we do about at least what kind of effort should we make to correcting the history? What should be presented by the way of history? And as a result, we formed, as you know, the SNCC Legacy Project, and begin this collaboration with Duke and with other scholars. Hassan Kwame Jeffries, and comes immediately to mind. Emily Crosby comes immediately to mind. Wes Hogan comes immediately to mind. So we began with scholars as a project now to begin to talk through it. You will remember those meetings, John. Talk through, I mean, how should we approach the history? What should we do? We don't know very much about the internet, for instance. How do we do that? Because it seemed, even in our ignorance, to be a valuable tool for trying to get out the kind of history we wanted. So this is all part of, if we had a lot of time, I would quote, because I use her frequently, I would quote Ella Baker on history and what she's talking to us about history. But I will use the last line of the quote I usually use. She's telling us after what she thinks history needs to be. I am saying, she says, as you must too, that in order for us to see where we are going, we not only must remember where we have been, but we must understand where we have been. And that's really been, this is Ms. Baker speaking to us, and that has really been the driving principle, if you will, of my approach to history and writing and documenting movement history.
Carolyn, thanks so much. I'm really struck by, and I should tell the audience, I've sent questions to everybody before this, but this group is so good, I'm going off script. Like, I feel like y'all can handle it. So I'm really struck by the way that each of you have approached storytelling, and it's so personal. And what I've heard, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, is that a lot of the practice that you've been engaged in has been filling a void, right? That there is an absence that you're trying to fill in. And I wonder about the labor and care that you have to undertake for yourself. Like, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. And I'm going to kick it to Gina first and just sort of ask about how you see yourself carrying those stories forward.
Okay, I was just writing that down, so when I go off into left field, I know where to come back to. So the question is about labor and care and how I carry stories forward. I mean, I was thinking about like not knowing how to approach documenting stories on the internet, right? What you're just speaking on. And I was thinking about Heather and I being artists. We're visual artists. Heather's a sculptor. She makes giant, beautiful sculptures. I make really tiny drawings on paper. Neither of us went to library school. Both of us just have a really strong interest in research and an eye for what is missing. We both ask a lot of questions, and when there's not an answer to that question or not a straightforward approach to finding that answer, I think it I don't know, it triggered something in us, which is where the Black Lunch Table came from. And I think that in developing that project, and I'll speak from the point of view of Black Lunch Table, and developing that project as artists who didn't have library degrees or degrees in computer science, we had to, is that the right way to put that? Yeah, I think, yeah, we had to rely on the skills of the people that we brought onto our team. But it's also really exciting because, you know, they helped solve a lot of problems or help find solutions for presenting the material that we were producing with our roundtables, and also produced way more questions too. So it's like, yes, we can do these things, but we're metadata tagging all of the transcripts from these conversations. Like, should it just be one person or three people who are doing this? Doesn't matter who those people are in relation to the speakers, who's describing the conversation. Are they a person with a similar experience, life experience to the people that are involved in the conversation? We've been talking about creating hosting our own archive versus working with something that is, prefab. So having a bespoke server. This is what they told me. Having a bespoke system, creating a bespoke system that would work the way that we need it to, is a complicated and costly solution, but it would solve all of the problems that we have right now. Sorry, I'm trying to decide how much I've diverged from the original question. How do we just? I think on the other hand, it is out of necessity that we work with people across many skill sets, but it definitely makes for a richer project because we don't know the things that we don't know. We didn't know what was actually possible for the archive, I think, when we set out to build it. The archive began as an IAH, the Institute for Arts and Humanities at UNC Digital Innovation Lab project. And I think most of that research semester, we were in conversation with people in library sciences and computer sciences, just trying to figure out like all the possibilities for how to host this information, how to tag it, what were best practices for transcription, kind of just figuring our way through what standards made sense for the project and where we wanted to create our own standards. And care, I could say a lot about. I think I'll say it briefly though. The team lives all over the country, so our conversations are always online. Our collaboration is almost always online. And the thing that I have loved working with the Black Lunch Table team either in one-on-one work sessions or in small groups was that a good portion of our meeting was just catching up, just checking out on how everyone's doing. How are these work practices for you? Like, can you actually manage, doing all of this transcription? Also, yes, your child is welcome in this meeting, but allowing life to be part of the work of building, or life is part of the work of building.
So the same question. Yes. And I saw you point to Ms. Hamer over your shoulder. So
Yeah, no, right now I'm in the COFO building, which is the Council of Federated Organizations, Jackson, Mississippi headquarters. The Margaret Walker Center operates the building as a museum now. But previously, before the Margaret Walker Center took it over, it was the Fannie Lou Hamer Institute. So this is a legacy piece of art there. But yeah, to your question about labor and care and carrying stories forward, I agreed so much with what Gina said about relying on the skills of others and recognizing the really real nature of the costs of this work, like the actual monetary costs, but also like the emotional and physical costs. And recognizing, along with relying on the skills of others, you have to be cognizant of the fact that you don't know everything and you have to figure out what it is you don't know, and sort of go from there. And you also mentioned creating your own standards. And that's something that I have had to do. Coming to the Margaret Walker Center, and to Jackson State in general, there hasn't been an oral history department, right? We didn't have a ton of oral historians working here before. So the archive that we have, I was telling John earlier before we started the session, is really haphazard. And a lot of my work has just been trying to figure out what I have and how I can make it more accessible, and make it so that those stories can last in perpetuity long beyond just me being here as the oral historian. So creating a standard for that work so that any students who work under me or my replacement one day is able to follow along those lines, maybe improve upon them, certainly, because I'm not like the most experienced oral historian. I'm not the #1 expert on preserving African American history or anything like that. But at least to have a base level to build off of moving into the future. I think also a part of it for me personally, has been realizing that I can only do what I can do. I wish that I had the funds and the time and the energy and the know-how to preserve and record all of the oral histories of every important Black person in Jackson, Mississippi, right? And by important, I do mean, like Mr. Cobb said, the everyday people who are doing the hard work. But I just don't have that capacity. I am a department of one. So I can only do what I can actually achieve in any given moment. And so largely what that means for me is I spend a lot of time, instead of doing preservation work or doing oral history interviews myself, teaching other people how to do preservation work and do oral histories, and interview, so that it's not just me who's doing this labor. And I don't feel that heavy burden of being the only one who's capable, in this like 5 mile or 10 mile radius of doing this work, that there are other students at JSU who are interested and know how and know where the resources are, know that they can borrow the recorders from the center and go out and do that work, that there are public libraries that have access, that there are senior centers and other groups that can come to me, take a workshop, and feel confident that they know how to conduct their own interviews amongst themselves and know that they can come to me to preserve them here at the Margaret Walker Center. I find that doing that is care not just for the community and not just for the potential oral histories themselves, but it's care for me because I can kind of take a breath and release that anxiety and that feeling that the work will never get done, because I know that I don't have to just count on me to get it there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I'm gonna just pause for one moment and speak to our audience and say that if you have questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box. We're gonna come to the question part in just a moment. Charlie, it's a similar question, but I'm gonna tweak it just a little bit because, you could just as easily be retired and living in some fantastic villa and
I appreciate your optimism. Go ahead.
but no, but in all seriousness, I wonder about, what are some of the practices that people can, like in our audience, embrace for them to begin to be storytellers themselves. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about like what kind of keeps you going in the storytelling world or sphere of memory work.
Well, I'm a little different in some respects than somebody that's a professor or an academic and whatnot, because I'm not that. I'm a writer. That's what I do. And the principle that drives my writing, and I chose that principle, the principle that drives my writing, which is largely, with one exception, largely about the Southern freedom movement, is to push forward the voices that are usually not heard in discussion of movement life, movement struggle, movement principles. And I have some advantages in this. I know a lot of people in the movement in the South. I worked in Mississippi for almost 5 years up in the Delta. I know, and so what it does, and I'm not sure that's an advantage that everybody can have, in trying to do documentary work or work on the movement, because I found, if you read my books, you'll see that they are loaded with not just quotes, but elaborations on struggle by movement people. And it's interesting because when I talk to them, and it's a shrinking number, let me say, when I talk to them, those conversations, those discussions are more than interviews. They often become exchanges, because I'm interviewing somebody, asking them a question, say Charles McLaurin up in Indianola, and they will say things like, well, you remember, Charlie, when we did this, that, or the other thing, and sometimes I don't remember. So it colors the work in a different kind of way, I think, than is available to most historians, archivists, or whatever. The thing to understand, because I think you can continue doing this, is I try and push forward the voices that are not usually heard in analysis and description of movement struggle. That's what all of my writing is about. It's not consciously meant for archival purposes, although I get Bob Moses' son, Omo Moses, has a book coming out in January about both his growing up as Bob Moses' son, his early days in Tanzania, because Omo was born in Tanzania, and his growing up in Cambridge and whatnot. And I had to help him with the book. I shipped him all of the interviews I had done with Bob. It's like hundreds of pages, right, for the book Radical Equations. And he put them unexpectedly to me, chunks of them, large chunks of them, in his book, because he's talking about the Algebra Project and his work with the Algebra Project that Bob founded. So sometimes interviews, I'm trying to do the same thing with John. Whenever I get done with this next book, I've done hundreds of interviews with the Movement for Black Lives, and I'm still way behind on this book project. I mean, but being a writer, I think, consciously a writer, not a teacher, not a professor, being a writer with a movement background, because the movement that I became a part of really has structured my whole approach to journalism and writing and books. But being a writer full time, even at my age, even retired for 20 years, gives me both an advantage and a different kind of perspective. I have strong views about what's important to understand, and I try and write about it. And one of the strong views I have, and I was talking with somebody who had read something I'd written some years ago, and she said what struck her was how prominent was the role and leadership of women in what I wrote. And I hadn't noticed it. I just wrote what I understood, but she picked up on that. And I thought about it. I said, she's right. You can't tell as a writer what's going to be picked up, what's going to be preserved, what's going to be used. All I can do, I feel, is just put what I think, and what I think is the importance of ordinary people. I think you can put what you think out there, and you have various forums, a lot more than back in the day when I was employed as a journalist and writer, a lot more than I have. I'm sort of envious of y'all's generation in that sense, that there's a lot more tools out there for getting information and thinking out there. And I appreciate a lot of the newer scholarship that has begun to emerge.
Thanks so much, Charlie. And I appreciate you that you think I'm young. Thank you so much.
Believe me, you are to me.
Alyssa Ray, I'm gonna ping pong back to you real quick with a similar question in terms of like what kind of tools can people in the audience take forward in their storytelling? And I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit to some of the transcription work that you've done in your career too, and how that might be useful.
Yeah, I think the most important tool that anyone can develop and work on over time is their listening skills. Um, a lot of times people conflate hearing with listening, and as an oral historian, as an interviewer, you learn something like a quality of deep listening, of really being present in the moment, hearing what someone has to say, internalizing their stories before you even start to think of your next question or whatever the case may be. It's not easy and it does take time and practice to develop, but the more time you spend really, really, truly listening to people, the better at it you get. And the more heard people feel, the more willing they are to share their stories and to share details they might not have shared before and to go deeper than they've gone before. And so I think that that's such a important skill for folks to have, even if you're not an oral historian, even if you don't plan on having a career that involves interviewing people. It's a skill you use in any kind of work. It's a skill you use in your personal life. It's a skill you can use in your family and in building better relationships with people. And I find the better a listener you are, the better you can be at a lot of other things too. So yeah, that I think is my answer to this question of skills folks can develop and take forward. What was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Oh, it's about your work with transcription.
Right. Transcription. Yes. So obviously, listening is important for transcribing as well. But the work that I do in transcription, I'm not a professional transcriptionist. I don't transcribe all of the time. But in preserving an archive and making oral histories more accessible, transcription has largely become a bigger and bigger piece of the daily work that I have to do. And the way that I think about Black voices in particular has really shaped the way I think about transcription. You'll often find in libraries and in archives a very standard kind of language, a very academic kind of language. And even when you're reading transcripts of oral histories of folks who aren't academics or professors, they don't always look like themselves on paper. Sometimes they look like a caricature of themselves, or sometimes they have been sanitized to meet a particular standard of an archive. And the work that I've done in transcription has really been about making transcripts read true to who the people are, how they sound, and the stories that they're telling, so that we can preserve a bit of their identity as well, at not just the story that they're trying to tell, but who they are and the essence of who they are that comes out in the way that they speak. Black language is so beautiful, and for years and years of it to either be sanitized or characterized or I just felt that there needed to be a middle ground. And so I've developed a style guide, oral history transcription style guide that kind of speaks to that. I've taught workshops and courses and all sorts of things on transcription practices and ways of doing it in a like kind of decolonialized manner. And that's a skill that also, just like listening, you can develop over time, really understanding how to put people's voices onto a page. It's, I think, kind of similar to writing. There are obviously differences. There's less creativity probably in transcription, but there's still some, and it requires a little bit of artistry, I think. But that's something that you can certainly develop over time and learn how to do. Especially if you're interested in like preserving your own history or your family's history. Anyone can create an oral history interview and transcribe it and preserve it. It's just a matter of your skill level and practice. And maybe it's getting someone to consult you and show you the ropes. That's not as hard as it might seem. There are people like me all over the country who are just eager for an opportunity to share their knowledge and help get a project off the ground. So yeah,
So I,
that, yeah.
I'm gonna ask a quick question. Is the style guide available where people can find it?
I am working on that.
Okay,
By
okay.
the end of this month, it should be available on the Margaret Walker Center's website on our oral history page. Right now, for the last year and a half that I've been developing it, I've just been sharing it with a select few people, getting their feedback, helping to perfect it. So I'm currently, like literally right before this session started, I was reviewing it and I'm working on cleaning up a final draft. Yeah.
Well, it just strikes me that that kind of innovation could really only be done by someone from the inside, right? Who sees the ways in which Black voices have been traditionally interpreted and knows that, well, that's not how that person sounds really. And so it's sort of tilting on its head the way that we traditionally might look at oral histories. Go ahead.
And I would add, it's not just oral histories too. You'll find medical transcripts and courtroom transcripts that do a horrible disservice to Black people and what they're saying and what their meaning is, because the people who are transcribing those interactions have no idea. They aren't insiders. They're not Black or familiar with Black community or Black language. And so they take what people are saying so much more literally than is often necessary, because they don't understand the rules and the syntax of Black language, which we have. Like it's not just slang, and it's not just dialect. Like there are rules and particular patterns to the way that we speak that mean something to us that might not necessarily mean the same things to others who are reading it 10, 15 years down the line or in a textbook to study. And so it makes a difference. It makes a difference to health outcomes, and it makes a difference to justice outcomes as well.
The same question, and I'm gonna, in terms of like tools that the audience can take with them when it comes to storytelling, but I'm gonna also ask you to speak to your artistic side, because I'm sure that there's some people who are in the audience who are visual artists, or they do, sculpture or whatever. And so how do you sort of blend those two worlds together in ways that they might think about doing the same?
Yeah. I just wrote a whole bunch of notes from what both of you just said. And I'm going to try to bring in some of that too in this response. So among the notes that I wrote, I think a lot about how everyone was an artist at some point. My son is 11. I mean, and an artist not as in maybe you draw every day, but an artist as in that you are curious and you ask questions. You ask a lot of questions. My son has always asked a lot of questions, and as he gets older, the questions are harder. I don't always have answers for them, but I think maybe that's what artists do in our work generally. And that we're not afraid to break things. And I don't mean like physical objects necessarily, but I mean like to break the website or break the platform or to dive into this online archive that you don't really know how to navigate and just poke around, right? I think as we become older, generally we become more cautious about how we engage with online platforms. A lot of the research that I do for my independent work is in platforms like the IPUMS or like the census, data.census.net. And like I said, I don't have a background in data research or in archiving or in library sciences. I just am curious to find some answers and maybe harder questions. One of the lessons of BLT, Black Lunch Table, is that archives are not read-only. We authored a text for the Wikipedia for a very nerdy compendium of writing, which is like the Wikipedia anniversary book, but one of the parts of the chapter that we authored is just talking about how Wikipedia is often treated as read-only, that everybody can edit it, and that there is a presumption that you need to have a special set of skills or knowledge, and really you just have to be able to research and have time and interest in doing it. Let's see. Guess talk about independent work. So a lot of my independent work is related to data visualization. I'm trying to think of the first piece that I did. I did a series of drawings that was just about the weather, and how the weather reports, like as you see them in newspaper, it's like a little sun and clouds. It doesn't really have a direct relationship to what's happening outside. But I was thinking about how, populations of people are represented with these little dots or with like a little character of a person. And it's supposed to convey some information about our lived experience and mostly falls short in doing that. So I'm thinking about how the work of an artist can illustrate that disparity between the way that phenomena are reduced to like these little symbols, right? And move further and further away from lived experience. And sorry, I'm trying to respond to everything that you guys just said as well. I do think a lot about transcription and translation too. Our project attempts to do something very close to verbatim, which means that the process is much slower than it would normally be, but it's always been important to capture as much of the essence of the conversation, including like all of the background chatter and these like stutters or ums or long pauses. I did an oral history project myself where I was the subject, which was unusual, but one of the things that was really hard for me in the editing was that all the ellipses were taken out of my speech. And as you can see now, I do have pauses in my speech. And so when it was presented back to me, it read oddly because I thought I don't speak that way. There was definitely a moment where I was taking a second to think, right? And something about the absence of the ellipses made my the way that I was speaking seem more assertive in a way that I am not, or like aggressive in a way that I am not. So back to your question, to talk about how the work relates to how this relates to my work. So I'm working on a series of drawings right now, which is a years-long project, which is a reimagining of the W.B. Du Bois data portraits, just using contemporary data. For those who aren't familiar with that, it's a series that was compiled in like 1900 on the occasion of the Paris Exposition. There's 67 drawings in that series. And I have accepted that it's going to take a couple of years to do all of this work. And I think when I first set out to do it, it's like, I don't know of anyone else who is doing this. It's cool that, it's not it's not a particularly innovative premise, but I thought that it needed to be done. So basically I'm taking these drawings and updating them with contemporary data. So looking at data from 1900, comparing it to data from 2020 and remaking these drawings with new data. So they look very similar to the originals, but you can see how some things have shifted and some things have stayed completely the same. I guess maybe the lesson that I wanted to share here is that I think in the 4 years that I've been working on it, I've found some other artists and friends who are also working with the same set of drawings. So Mimi Onuoha, who's another artist who works with data, created a series of drawings that is a reinterpretation of these data portraits. Will Villalongo is creating a series of prints, where he and his partner did worked with university students to create their own research in addition to census research, and are working to create a print set of these drawings. And the Astor Gates, who's here in Chicago, also did a series. But I like thinking that, artists collectively are maybe tackling similar questions and approaching them in different ways. So I like that all of our research could be contributing, and all of our projects are part of this larger conversation.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. So I'm going to read the few questions that we have in our Q&A box. A couple of them are Bob Moses related, so I think Charlie could probably best speak to a couple of these. So the first one is starts off from Joe Levette, Anderson Downey. It says, "Greetings, my name is Joe Levette, and I work for Bob Moses in Mississippi in the late 1990s to the early 2000s. A history thief is what she calls herself. Because at that time, the filmmaker who did the movie Freedom Song had his assistant to email me the transcript of all the interviews they did with the folks in Macomb, Mississippi, and elsewhere. This was the oral history interviews used to make the film. It was over 500 pages. I had to send it to Kinko's from my then web TV email address. Bob had to go pay for it and pick it up. I held on to that 500 pages for almost 10 years because I was afraid it would get lost. I shipped it to the Algebra Project office around the time the SNCC Legacy Project was forming. Julian Bond emailed me to thank me. I'm a proud history thief, and thank you, Charlie Cobb. You answered my question when you started talking about Olmo's book." And then the second Bob Moses question comes from Rebecca in the audience, and she asked, "Were you influenced by Bob Moses?"
Bob and I talked a lot about a lot of different things, but I guess the basic point is that Bob, for me, and we were close, Bob made concrete the idea, for me, the idea of organizing at the grassroots. That really, I come out of the sit-in movement, protesting, challenging segregation in public spaces. And so the idea of organizing, really, although Ella Baker had raised this early on with SNCC, it was made for me in Mississippi. And it was the reason I wound up staying, because I had no intention of staying in Mississippi. I tell the teasers of Mississippi and say, y'all kidnapped me. But Bob made concrete the idea of organizing at the grassroots. And that idea is what, as I said earlier, my writing is always about pushing the thinking and voices of ordinary people forward. And that grows out of the organizing tradition that I encountered in Mississippi and SNCC. And that organizing tradition is what's at the roots of my commitment to pushing the voices of ordinary people forward in my writing and my involvement with the SNCC Legacy Project.
Thank you, Charlie. So another question comes from an anonymous attendee. Do any of you conduct filmed interviews? And if so, how do you handle transcription? Do you clean up the follow-along transcription that will be available as part of the archive? And do you also create a full paper transcript that is separate? How do you feel about the importance of the relationship between the video or audio document and the need for a transcript?
Can I just say this is about more than film then, if you're talking about transcriptions. And I want to say that I try and get transcribed, and I raise money to do it from foundations, grants. In one occasion, I actually talked the publisher into paying for the transcription on one occasion. I think as a writer, not a filmmaker, transcriptions are important because that's what leaves the tracks to what you're doing. There's a lot in the transcriptions that you're not going to get in the book, or that you're not going to get in the film, and even not in audio interviews, which are edited. So I believe transcriptions are critically important because that's really what gives longevity to your work. I consciously try and on a couple occasions have paid out of my own pocket, once on time, for the transcriptions. I believe there needs to be that kind of record. I believe that as a writer.
I'd like to
Yes.
speak to this.
Yes, please.
So there's a huge difference, right, between an oral history interview that's being preserved in an archive compared to what I like to call an end product. And an end product can be a documentary, it can be a book, it can be an edited YouTube video. An oral history interview in its entirety is meant to be preserved. So that's from the moment you start the recording to the moment you end it. All of the pauses, all of the breaks, if it's multiple recordings, all of that is supposed to be preserved. And generally speaking, as an oral historian, I always want to lead people to that original record first. I'm sure like in high school and college and papers and things like that, you've heard of like sources and what is it, like a first source or a second, what is that called? Is that the right term?
Primary, secondary, tertiary.
Yeah, your primary, secondary, and tertiary resources or sources, right? And oral history is a primary source. The transcript of that oral history is then a secondary source because it is a translation of the original. And so it's part of the reason why I work so hard to create this transcription style guide that's a more verbatim approach to preserving Black language is because you want that secondary source to be as good as possible, as close to a primary source as possible. But the more you standardize and clean up that language or try to edit that transcript, the further it gets from that primary document. And so while I do think a transcription is super important, and I think that a transcript helps create greater accessibility and it makes the oral history a lot more usable for folks like Mr. Cobb, who's writing a book, or someone who's creating a documentary or creating a website or creating some other kind of end product, right? It's really important to preserve that original recording in whatever state it was originally recorded in. So I lost track of the question because I think there was another part to it. Let me see if I can go back up here. Cleaning up the transcript. So what I will say is a lot of the cleaning or edits you make to a transcript, whenever possible, should be based on whoever the narrator was, whoever the interviewee was who was being interviewed. How they want to appear on paper should be like your primary goal, to make them read that transcript and be like, yeah, this is me. This is what I sound like. This is what I want to present to the world. That should really filter into whatever decisions you make on cleaning up a transcript. I have suggested to people that you can have two versions of a transcript. You can have the very verbatim version that you preserve in the archive, and then you can have a cleaner version that might go on your website and be more easily read by like a fifth grader who's doing their history project. And maybe they can't filter through or understand the differences between spoken language and written language, right? Like you can have multiple versions and that's perfectly fine too. But I think as long as you're critically asking yourself questions about what you're doing and why you're doing it, you'll wind up with a product that is worth preserving and keeping.
Yeah, I'll just sort of add that in our own work here through the Movement History Initiative, so Charlie and his esteemed colleague, Jaria Gusto, sort of developed a practice that was built upon other practitioners that they brought to us called critical oral histories. And in a critical oral history setting, it's actually a group where the participants are asked to reflect on a history, not just solely from their own telling of the events, but through artifacts, archival documents, photographs, and the attempt is not just to get into the what happened, but the how and the why it happened. And so we've done that through our work with the SNCC Legacy Project, the SNCC veterans, along with some of the Movement for Black Lives activists, to try and get them to collectively, because the story also manifests itself very differently when you're in a group setting versus when it's just one-on-one and you and the interviewer. But after that recording is done, we have the transcript created, but as Alyssa Ray mentioned, we will send it back to the participants and ask them to edit, annotate, comment, and even augment that transcript, because sometimes you might find yourself in the middle of a thought or might need to contextualize something that was said. And we give them an opportunity to do that on their own. And then that edited transcript gets put into the archive alongside the original one and the recording itself. So you have these layers of documentation of that gathering and that conversation that, makes it even more interesting for historians to get their hands on it. They're like, okay, now what's going on here? So I'll just sort of add that as a note as well.
Yeah, that's definitely a rich way to preserve the entire interaction.
And I'll note that a lot of that practice is based on your work, Alyssa Ray. So we're going to give you some props for that.
Little old me.
So
Don't get big.
We've got 5 more minutes left, and I think this last question from the audience is something that will it'll be a good way to close this out. So this is from an anonymous attendee. With communities whose stories are frequently sought out with little compensation, agency, and autonomy of how their stories are presented, how would you create a form of adequate compensation for the inherent value of their lived experiences, and be a means to conduct critical histories, and see a less extractive dynamic so that many more archives are stewarded by the communities represented in the collections? So I know we only got 5 minutes. That's a big one, but if anyone wants to take a stab at that, I'll open it up.
That's the question. That is the question. That I think that is the heart of all of the work that we do. Everyone in the Zoom room, everyone who is probably a participant watching, like, this is the question we're all trying to answer in the work that we're doing. I believe very firmly in narrator compensation. I think it's an issue we need to tackle in oral history. So often we've fallen along the lines of journalism and saying that you can't pay for stories, right? But I agree, there is an inherent value, there's inherent worth in the stories people have to tell, and also in the time. And everybody's time is valuable, and the time it takes to do this work is not negligible. And so I think there is a need for narrator compensation. I think there's a greater need for agency and autonomy, which is why I spend so much time training other folks to do oral history so that they can do their own interviews in their own community, and have that agency. So yeah, it's really important. I don't have like an answer of how this should be done. Luckily, oral history as like an academic field is fairly still new, and we're constantly evolving and creating better standards and better ethics and better practices in order to address these issues, especially as they come up. And I think particularly for communities that have felt like they've been extracted from like by universities and other like big name companies and organizations. So yeah, the best thing to do is buy a recorder and start recording your stories.
As a writer, I make it perfectly clear in my interviews that the person I'm interviewing for a book, not news, the person I'm interviewing for a book has absolute rights to the interview. It's not in the bioanalysis, except for preservation, because I tell people up front, at some point I'm going to give it to John here. They have absolute right to you, and I can't pay them money for that, but you can use it however you want. When Omo Moses called me to tell me he was doing this book and wondered if I had saved the interviews I had done with his father, I said, they're all in a box upstairs. I'll ship them to you. Use them however you want. And that's my rule. It's not the whole answer, but that's my own particular rule about interviews.
I guess I would just add, just thinking about what BLT does, and maybe more from an archiving perspective than for interviews per se. Two things that have two new projects that we have. One is a partnership with archive.org, which has an initiative to preserve specific websites. And so we've asked archive.org to preserve a handful of artists who are in our archive, their websites. So you can go to archive.org and the Wayback Machine and look at an iteration of website that existed 15 years ago, right? But what happens, artist websites change all the time or they disappear. So we're asking them to focus on people whose voices are in our archive already, and preserve their site as it was now. And another project that we're doing, just thinking about primary versus secondary and tertiary sources, is thinking about what happens to those voices and how they're narrativized. So we have a new partnership with a journal here in Chicago called 60, and they are taking material that exists in our archive and information about these artists and producing a piece of writing, a secondary source that can be used to as a reference directly from the archive, and also can be included in updating Wikipedia articles, which is really exciting. But as far as compensation, no, we should. But all of the interviews, all of the conversations happen over lunch or dinner. So, that's a small offering, but there should be more, of course.
I am going to stop us right there since we are exactly at 1 o'clock. And thank you so much to Alyssa Ray, to Charlie, and to Gina for this wonderful conversation, our first conversation of the day. I hope as an audience you all enjoyed it, the dialogue and learned something. And I will encourage you to join us in 30 minutes for our next session on a different Zoom link, and I put them in the chat a little bit earlier here. Fight the Power, New Memory Keeping, featuring Zakiya Collier, Malou Brooks, Judy Richardson, and Michael Morris. Thank you all again so much for your contributions and for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.